Hi everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today I wanted to go over how I blend Orton-Gillingham and Montessori together. Now to start with, I was Orton-Gillingham trained through the Michigan Dyslexia Institute in, I think, 2004. And I didn't start in Montessori until 2013. So for about 10 years, I had this Orton-Gillingham training, but I didn't have the Montessori. So when I went to Montessori training, I had already had this really established language program, but I added all the Montessori stuff into it. And I love Montessori and I think it's a wonderful method, but I do think there are areas where my Orton-Gillingham training is superior to my Montessori training. There's some really great techniques in the Montessori method. However, I will say that the weakest part of the Montessori method is the reading component. The grammar is great. The sound symbol relationship to beginning phonics is great. The writing and the development of the hand is great. But the reading part, after having my Orton-Gillingham training, I felt was really weak. And if you are out there and you have your AMI training, your AMS training, or you're just trying to incorporate some Montessori, but the reading component just doesn't feel like it's there, you are not alone. There are a lot of people struggling to still teach reading in the Montessori environment, and this is where Orton-Gillingham can really help you thrive in your classroom and really help you develop the reading area in your classroom a little bit differently than your albums. Blending Orton-Gillingham and Montessori is becoming a really popular thing to do. So let's just start with how I approach reading and how I tweak it from my AMI album. The first thing we do is we do the sound symbol relationship with the sandpaper letters. Now this is exactly how it's presented in my AMI album. I choose 3 letters with contrasting sounds, and I do try to find contrasting looks. If you're introducing letters that have a similar sound and shape, I would say try to avoid that as much as possible and try to do things that are very contrasting. So I would start out using the Montessori approach, doing the sound symbol relationship with the sandpaper letters. Now I've already done a video on how we do the 3-period lesson with the sandpaper letters, so I'll link that below so we don't have to go over that again. And this really brings me to the first deviation on how I teach reading just a little bit differently than my albums. In Montessori, in my AMI training, my trainer said once a student has learned about half of the sandpaper letters, you can go ahead and introduce the movable alphabet. Here's where I'm going to change things just a little bit. I'm going to say when your student has learned about 5 to 10 different sounds, go ahead and introduce a reduced movable alphabet. And this is going to look a little bit differently because we're going to introduce reading just a little bit sooner. Now, because I'm AMI trained, I really do think that children write before they read. However, I see a lot of students who only know 5 to 10 letters, and a lot of them are older students. And those students are really, really struggling. They've got the same 5 sounds over and over again, but they can't seem to get any further. And what this is going to do by switching to a reduced movable alphabet sooner is going to help them make words with the few letters they know instead of waiting. Because if you miss out on that opportunity for starting to read, then it's really hard to get back to it. And if you keep making students wait past when they are ready, it's so much harder going forward. So presenting a smaller, reduced movable alphabet is going to help children jump into reading just a little bit sooner. And this is going to be really beneficial for older students who may have missed that window of opportunity. So let me show you what that looks like. Here is an example of a reduced movable alphabet that doesn't cost too much money. What I did is I just went on to Montessori Print Shop. I downloaded their movable alphabet, but you can make your own. You don't have to download anything. You don't have to make anything. You can just simply use what you have available. I would encourage you to still use the pink and the blue patterns or red and blue as you do in the movable alphabet. If you're making your own, make sure to keep those colors the same as what you're teaching, and then just do either 2 or 3 vowels, whatever the child has learned, and then some consonants, and try to make them contrasting. Now, what can you do with a reduced movable alphabet? Well, the movable alphabet is actually for writing. It's not for reading. But I had to develop something for a class that I took that kind of blends the 2 ideas together. And that is my syllable mat, my blending mat. Now, for anybody who is Orton-Gillingham trained, you know that we do blending on this blending board right here. In Orton-Gillingham, once we've introduced the sound symbol relationship, we'll go through blending activities by putting our cards on here. And we will do a vowel, and we'll get a bunch of consonants. And we'll just start a blending activity real quick. So once the child has understood that these 3 separate sounds make the r, a, d, we're going to start blending them together. R, rad. If they can't do all 3 sounds, take off that first one and go add, add, r, add, rad. So in Orton-Gillingham, we use the blending board and cards. I have changed this for the primary environment because I feel like we need a more hands-on way, a more visual way, a more sensorial way to experience this concept. Now, I do love my blending board and I do love my Orton-Gillingham cards. And I really like these cards that I got from the Michigan Dyslexia Institute because it gives you the print, the cursive, how to pronounce it, examples, and multiple spellings. So everything's kind of here on one card for this letter, for the grapheme. So for primary, instead of using this blending board, which I think works well for elementary, but for primary, I decided to invent this syllable mat because I really wanted more of a control of error for introducing these sounds, for introducing blending, and this leads into teaching syllables, which is really what I want to get into today, is how I teach the syllables. All right, so let's say that you've gone through the sandpaper letters. You've introduced the sound symbol for maybe 5 to 10 letters, and that includes, I would say, at least 2 vowels. Then we can start working with this syllable mat. Now, I made mine out of felt. It's really easy to sew. It's really easy to glue together if you want. But you can also do this out of paper. You could laminate it. You can make it as simple as you want. So if you like this idea, make it your own. I developed this for a class that I took for the Montessori Medical Partnership for Inclusion with Catherine Massey. And this is something that I've been using for the last 1.5 years now, and it's been great. I've used it for younger children and I've used it for older children, and each time it's been a great success. So I've used it in a few different ways. Play with it and see how it works for you. But this is really my blending mat, which is going to actually become a syllable mat as we teach through the syllables. So as soon as they learn those first few letters, we can go ahead and get our reduced movable alphabet out, and we can get out this blending mat, and we can show them that the pink matches the pink. We don't even have to spell anything at first. Just introduce that pink matches pink and blue matches blue. That's all we have to do for the first part of this lesson. And that's going to go pretty quickly, right? They're going to be able to see that pretty quickly. Now, the next part is where I would also do something different that our AMI albums don't do, which is I would introduce the concept of consonants and vowels. When I went through my entire language album for my AMI training, I realized we don't have any lessons in Montessori, no official primary AMI lessons actually teach consonants and vowels. And I think that's really important. When we get into teaching our syllables, we need to use the word vowel a lot, especially when we're working with vowel teams. I think it's really important to introduce that the pink is what we call consonants and the blue is what we call vowels. And you can go ahead and do a 3-period lesson if you feel like you need it for this one, or you can just introduce it informally. It's really up to you, and it really probably depends on where your student is at. So that's the first part of using this mat. And they can simply go through and they can start putting letters on there. K, t. Now this is an actual word that we made. However, it doesn't have to be an actual word. The important part about this is that we're learning this first part of the syllable, which is the closed syllable. They're simply putting a syllable together. Let's not worry about making real words or silly words. Let's not try to get them to make real words at all. This is simply them taking the sounds in isolation and putting them together and seeing this pattern. And what is this pattern? This is a consonant, vowel, consonant. And if you have any training in Orton-Gillingham or in phonics, you know that this is the closed syllable pattern. And so when we're working with this as a syllable, we're not really worried whether or not this is going to be a word yet. We're not really worried if it's spelled the way it should. Like for instance, if I spell this, k-it, kit. Well, as an adult, you know kit is spelled with a K, but we're not going to make that correction. This is simply about putting the letters on, making the correct sound, and starting to blend it together. Now, if the 3 letters are way too difficult, always take off that first letter and blend from the vowel. It, and then unfold it. It, mit, mit. And so this is how I begin differentiating reading with my Orton-Gillingham training and my Montessori training. Now, this is something that I've invented. It's something that I've played with over the years. So this isn't an official Orton-Gillingham lesson, and it's not an official Montessori lesson. It's a blend I took between the two, thinking about how I have a sensorial impression of a closed syllable, and also how do I get my students reading sooner and with less letters, because some of them really need that. And it also still incorporates the idea of the movable alphabet with the pink and the blue. And while we are doing a little more reading, this can be simply a writing activity as well. We're solidifying this pattern. This is a sensorial impression of the closed syllable. Right here is the closed syllable pattern. We have a vowel consonant. This is going to make that short sound, right? The closed syllable makes the short vowel sound. So that's the first thing we're teaching. And we're not going to teach anything different for a really long time until this idea is solidified. So it's okay if you have to tuck under that first part and just work with the vowel consonant. Those are words too, right? Those are really short words that the child can start reading. And you know what? That's pretty exciting. It might not seem like much, but if you have an older student who isn't reading at all and can't get past learning 5 sandpaper letters, they can still make words. So we don't want to shy away from the reading portion just because a child is struggling. We can't keep working on sandpaper letters forever, especially if that older child is past those sandpaper letter stages. Maybe from a learning perspective, they still need to learn those things, but developmentally, they may not be in that concrete stage to keep going back to those sandpaper letters. So you need to start thinking outside the box, play a little bit with your reading area and see what you can come up with. And for me, it was doing a closed syllable sensorial impression. And that's what this is right here. So the closed syllable is the first one I teach, and that really happens naturally. So we don't have to work too hard for that. That usually happens naturally with the movable alphabet regularly in the Montessori environment, but it's not very organized. It's not systematic. And I'm just adding in this systematic phonics into the Montessori method. So let's move on from the closed syllable. The next thing you can teach is the open syllable. And I'm going to go in this order. However, if you have some logic that tells you to go in a different order, that's okay. I've changed up the order for how I introduce things from other people. So as long as you have a logical reason why you're introducing the syllables in a certain order, I would say keep going, do it. It's okay to be different. But I'm going to show you how I introduce the open syllable next. So we've used this closed syllable pattern. Now we're going to open it. And I'm going to tell them that when we have 2 letters, a consonant and a vowel, and nothing coming after it, the vowel is going to say its own name. So instead of it's going to say may. Again, we're working with a syllable here, not a word. So don't worry about it being a word because we want the syllable pattern to be reinforced, not the word spelling. And we can go through a little exercise here of saying, okay, let's sound it out like we always do. See how this door is closed? This says mad, mad, makes the sound. However, if we take this off and we open the door up, there's nothing to make the A stop it from saying its name. So it says its own name, May. If we close the door, it stops the sound and it has to make the short sound of add. So I used this mat to teach the open syllable by explaining that this last consonant, this right here, is a door. And when it's closed, it stops the vowel from saying its own name. So it has to make that short sound. But when we open that door, it can say its own name. And its own name is A. And this is an example of another lesson that you can include in your Montessori classroom that is not in your Montessori albums. We teach that this is the A sound. So we know that it has a sound. But we usually take for granted that the children often already know that it has a name, and its name is A, and sometimes it can say its own name. So make sure to point that out. So when you're going through your sandpaper letters again, maybe you'll start saying something like, okay, let's do the short sound, and then we're going to do the long sound, and the long sound is where it's going to say its own name. So the door is open, it says its own name. The door is closed, it stops short, it makes the short sound. And that's how I teach the open syllable. Now, the open syllable, if there's absolutely no consonants at all, which can happen, right? It can stand alone, and it still says its own name. So that's how I teach the open syllable, and that's usually what I teach next. Because after the open syllable, I like to teach vowel teams. Now, the way I introduce vowel teams, you could do it through the green sandpaper letters, the phonograms, but I really don't work a whole lot with those phonograms. I might introduce the phonograms a little bit with the green sandpaper letters, but really I go on to other exercises and I use a different blending mat. So this is what I created for my vowel teams. And as you can see, this is green, just like the green sandpaper letters, and underneath is the blue, because we're going to be using vowels for the most part in this section. Now, again, you can change this up a little bit with your vowel teams. You can have it go this way, so you could put eat on here, E-A, and then T. You could put the whole thing on here, and you could spell the word meat. Or it could fold this way, and maybe you'd have the I-E vowel team that says I, and you could spell the word pie. So you can change this up. You have your vowel teams. Let's take a look at our vowel teams so that you know what they are. And this is how we symbolize it right here. But you won't be using that in primary. But I kept it on there anyways because sometimes I use this with elementary students too. So here are vowel teams. Now there's a little poem that goes with vowel teams, and if you haven't heard it, it goes, when two vowels go a-walkin', the first one does the talkin', and it says its own name. So when two vowels go a-walkin', the first one does the talkin', and it says its own name. And this is why it's important to introduce that open syllable concept, because now we're teaching vowel names. So you're going to work with vowel names with the open syllable and the vowel teams. And what's E's name? E, right? Two vowels go a-walkin', the first one does the talkin', and it says its own name, and its name is A. I, O, U, A, E. And when we're working with this new blending mat, we're going to go ahead and make some cards that match our green sandpaper letters so that everything is the same. So just get some note cards out. You don't have to be fancy unless you want to be, and that's perfectly fine. And what I like to do is introduce a vowel team like this. Get some scissors. I can cut it so that it's not taking up a lot of space. And we can simply match it. You see how this is green and this is green? That means they go together. Now, what sound does this make? When two vowels go a-walkin', the first one does the talkin', and it says its own name, and its name is E. All right, well, let's do our example from before. Eat, eat. Well, what if I put something at the beginning? Meat. What if we open it up at the end? What does it say? It says me. Now, as the adult, we know that this isn't the proper spelling of me, but again, this is a syllable, not a word. So we're really just looking at the syllable rule right here, because words are made up of syllables, and we want to look for those syllables within words. That's going to help us read and sound things out a lot better. So let's put meat back up there, and then we can play a blending game. Seat, seam, seal, see. And so that's all it takes really to introduce vowel teams. So I just get out my phonogram mat right here, and you can make one of these for every type of vowel team you want to put together. And I don't introduce these individually. As you can see, when we went through and read all of these, I introduced one rule, and all the vowel teams follow the one rule. So you don't need to introduce these separately. You can introduce them all together as a group, and then your student has just learned one rule with a ton of different applications. The next thing that I like to introduce is the bossy R's, and I like to use the same blending mat, the same syllable mat as I used for the vowel teams. We might have to move it around a little bit, fold the sides either way, but it's going to look the same. It's just that we're now introducing a new rule. And for this rule, I introduced 5 new bossy R's. Now there are more bossy R's than 5. However, we have these traditional 5 that we start with, and that's really a great start for primary. Now, this is why it's really important when you're introducing the letter R with your sandpaper letters that you introduce it properly. The letter R, when you're introducing it with your sandpaper letters, makes a r sound. It does not make an sound, because an sound is a bossy R. So to differentiate that, we need to make sure that we are introducing the letter R properly. And when we get to our bossy R's, you can get out your phonograms again, or you can get out your blending mat and you can make your own cards. But I introduce R, or, and I choose one of the ers usually. Now, if it's an elementary student, I might introduce all 3 ers together if I feel like they can handle it. And I'll just say, these are the triplets. These are the sisters. And they may look just a little bit different, but they all make the same sound. If you feel like your student can handle that faster pace of learning all the ers at once, go ahead and do it. For other students, you may want to back down and just do one at a time. So I would teach all 3 and then do a 3-period lesson. And again, use your blending mat. You could do t or k, or switch it up. K or t, s or t. And so they start playing with it with this reduced movable alphabet, and you can introduce the syllables, and then you can do these blending games. And you know what makes it really fun, especially for the older students? Doing this with a friend. This does not have to be something that you do in isolation. Working with friends helps. Now, if they get too silly, obviously you have to separate them, but don't make this just an in isolation thing. If your student is motivated by peer experiences, team up with a friend. Sometimes they make some really silly words, and they go through and they'll make something really, really silly together, and they'll laugh and they'll giggle and they'll be like, what's that? Lorm. What's a lorm? And maybe when they get through that, they might think lorm, corm. Well, maybe they'll switch it to corn then, right? And they'll start looking at different sounds. They'll start listening to different sounds and start thinking through this, and they'll start changing it up. So one of the most important things you can do as you're introducing this is to make it fun. Find what motivates your student. I know sometimes in Montessori, we get really into the individualized work, but the older your student gets, the more they're going to be motivated by peer experiences, peer learning. And so I would encourage you to try and experiment with what works best for individual work and what really benefits from a group work or a peer work. because that can make all the difference in a student's success. The next thing I introduce is the magic E. Now, in Orton-Gillingham, I was introduced to this as the silent E rule. However, I'm trying to switch over to saying magic E because I like that better. And also because the silent E is a spelling rule too that comes down the road. So if you get your Orton-Gillingham training, not only are you going to learn the syllables, but you are going to learn spelling rules and spelling patterns. And there is a silent E spelling pattern. So I really want to make sure that I'm not confusing the student later on. So that's why I'm introducing this as magic E. As you can see, this is the number 3, and I'm not going in the same order as these cards suggest. I have my own way of introducing them. So we started out with the closed syllable. We did the open syllable, which taught that the vowel can sometimes say its own name. And then we moved on to the vowel teams, where the vowels also say their own names. So there's a second rule for when it says its own name. And then we moved on to the bossy R's, which the R controls the vowel and makes it make this whole new sound. So we've introduced that whole new sound by our controlled vowels. And now we're moving on to the magic E. And the magic E is going to go back to the rule of when a vowel says its own name. So as you can see, it's really important to introduce when a vowel says its own name. We start out with that short sound and we work with that for a really long time. And then we start getting into the rules where the vowel can say its own name. Let's go back to our closed syllable mat. And let's make a closed syllable word. And we've already discussed this word. This is something that should be familiar to the student. And this is mad, right? It makes that short sound, makes the ah sound. But with our new rule for the magic E, we're going to put the E on the end of the word right here. And this E is going to jump back and make the A say its own name. It's silent, so we got to cross it off so that it's silent, and make it jump back and make the A say its own name. So what does it say if it says its own name? Made. Made. And so all you really need is to add this E at the end of your closed syllable mat to make the A say its own name. And then you can go through different blending activities. Sal. Sal. Well, let's try this. Cross off the E, jump back, make the A say its own name, sail. And that's all we have to do for introducing the magic E. Pretty simple. So again, we're just finding another rule for when the vowel says its own name. Next comes the consonant LE. This one can be a little bit tricky. So the consonant LE syllable, I like to introduce before the diphthong because I really like to go through all the rules with the vowels first before we bring in the diphthongs, because diphthongs are like vowel teams. They look like vowel teams, but they don't make the same sound. And so we really want to leave that one to last, in my opinion, so that we don't confuse the student. So we're going to do the consonant LE first, and I'm going to bring out a different type of mat. So right here, let's start out with a consonant LE sound. And chances are in primary, you're not going to get to this step. This is pretty advanced. So this is really going into more of the elementary years. And when we do this, let's just put it at the end of the word. We need to make sure and introduce this as an ending sound. And also, it's its own syllable. That's one syllable right there. So in order to use this, we're actually starting to make 2-syllable words. And this is where syllable division starts coming in. So here we have a consonant LE sound, and this always goes at the end of a word. And when it goes at the end of the word, it's its own full syllable. It's not connected to anything else. So I'm going to use this little divider here to show that we have divided the word into 2 syllables. And what we have here is, on this side, is an open syllable, right? So what's our rule? There's nothing to stop the sound. The door is open, right? See this door? And we have the phonogram door here, which we can use in a second if we want. We're just going to fold it under. When there's nothing stopping the sound, this becomes an open door, an open syllable, and it says its own name. So this says tay, tay. And what does this say? Bull. Tay, bull, table, table. Do you see how this made one sound and that got one clap? Tay. This got another sound, so it gets a second clap. Bull. So we divided this word into two different sound chunks, tay and bull. And when we divide words into two or more different sound chunks, we call those syllables. And we can show that by putting a divider here. And do you see how easily we just introduced a sensorial impression of syllable division? You could do it on the mat too. Saying when you have the consonant LE ending, and you can go through all of them at once if you want, and I'll show you that in just a second. And you can introduce this as a divider. It's just a piece of paper. It's nothing special. You can start introducing that when we break a word into two different chunks of sound, tay and bull, we divide it up. We are dividing it according to syllables, to its sounds, and we can show that by putting a divider in there. Now you can go through, you can make cards for all of the consonant LE sounds like bull, cull, dull, full, gull, pull, tull, zol. And you can go through all of that. It's going to be the same rule, right? It's the ul sound combined with a consonant. So you can make a card for each one of them, and it's going to be 2-syllable words. We're starting to get into syllable division. So that can happen pretty naturally if you use this type of a format, a very sensorial impression of all of this. Now let's move on to the most challenging of all of the syllables, in my opinion, and that is the diphthongs. And they look like vowel teams, so they get confusing, but they make a unique sound. So a diphthong is a syllable containing two vowels in which a new vowel sound is formed by the combination of both vowel sounds. So the example is boil, oi, oi. Do you hear the two different sounds? Ow, owd, k. So we have the combination of two vowel sounds, but it's not the short sound, and it's not the long sound, and it's not the bossy R sound. It's a whole different sound. And you can go through and you can introduce as many as you want. And this is a great place also to still use the small movable alphabet. And I can show you, if you don't know what the small movable alphabet lesson is, I can show that to you. So if you're curious about how to use the small movable alphabet with the phonograms, leave a comment down below and I'll make sure to put that on my list of videos to get out to you. So the reason why I'm using my Orton-Gillingham cards for this one, and these are ones I got through the Michigan Dyslexia Institute, is because I really want to show you how this works with the diphthongs. So if we have the diphthong oi, we can turn it over, and this will give you the example of what it sounds like, what words are in it, and what the multiple spellings are. Now, as you go through all the different diphthongs, take a look. This one has a lot of different sounds. It has some different rules and has multiple spellings. So we have the ow sound, the oo sound, the sound, the o sound, and the multiple spelling. So all of that is on the back of these cards. So that way, as the teacher, if you need a little bit of a reminder yourself for everything, I really like these cards. So I will drop a link for where you can order these down below the video. But we have oi. We have this one, which follows a couple different rules. So you're going to have to decide how you want to introduce that first. I would start with where this card starts, because these Orton-Gillingham cards do put a lot of thought into a system, into an order, and I would follow this order if you have them. So I would start with that ow sound and then move on to the oo. So introduce the ow first. So these you might want to start out one at a time because they do get a little complicated. And I would just introduce one sound at a time. Now, when I tutor for elementary students, sometimes they already know multiple sounds, and I might introduce them all at the same time if the student just seems geared towards that and naturally inclined in already reading several words. I'll just introduce this, and a lot of the times they already know that it makes different sounds in different contexts, but for a child with dyslexia or for a primary student, that's a little much. So maybe for the diphthongs, you just introduce a few. So you could start with the ow sound, and maybe you want to fold it under. so it's a little easier. Out. And what if we did that? Owl. Now we know that this isn't the correct spelling for the word owl, right? And when we go through our diphthongs, you're going to see that we have that second sound, as in cow or owl. And what I would say to you if you're using this, especially if you're using this in the primary environment, is that this is not about spelling. This is about understanding the sound in isolation and blending it together and reading it. So we're not focused on spelling on this one. The spelling really comes in handy when it comes with that small movable alphabet activity. And so right now, just focus on the fact that are they making the sound correctly and are they blending it correctly? Are they understanding the rule that you've introduced? If they are, then don't worry about it, because we're also going to introduce this ow at some point in time. And eventually they'll understand there are two different ways to spell it. This is the wrong way, and this is the correct way. And that's one of those things that we can use later on for a spelling activity in a separate lesson for spelling. But that's not what this is about. And when it comes to primary, chances are you're only going to get to a few of the diphthongs, if any at all. And I find these to be the hardest to introduce. So I would introduce them sparingly. Now, if you're looking at this ow, you might be thinking, well, wait a second. We've introduced all the syllable rules right here. There are only 7 syllables. We've gone through them all. But what about the consonant digraphs, right? Well, consonant digraphs are not a syllable. CH, SH, TH, and TH has a soft and a hard sound. So those are the H brothers, and I introduced those pretty quickly, but they're not a syllable. And this is something I really don't like about the green sandpaper letters. I don't like them all being lumped together because the syllables have rules. They have rules that they follow, and then we have the consonant digraphs along with it. And so when we do the consonant digraphs, you can go ahead, you could either make a whole new mat or just introduce this as one sound. Now you can keep it green if you want it to match your green sandpaper letters. If your student is learning well and they're learning quickly with the letters and the syllables, I would actually introduce the consonant digraphs before you get done with introducing the entire phonetic alphabet. These can be introduced at the same time as you start introducing your syllables. So you could do this with open syllables or with vowel teams. You could introduce this at the beginning of introductions to syllables. Don't wait to the very end. Feel free to introduce them sooner. So if you wanted to spell ouch, I would say introduce your consonant digraphs early. Work those in there, but don't introduce it as a syllable, because that's really not what it is. And you can go through when you're doing your consonant digraphs and you can introduce it on a mat like this. And you could do something like that. Atch. Now, we know that there's a spelling rule for TCH, right? But in primary, we're not introducing that. We're not getting into spelling rules today. We're only getting into syllables. Down the road in elementary, we're going to get into introducing those spelling rules, those exceptions. So there's rules for the TCH that we're going to introduce later on. So don't worry about this. This isn't a spelling activity. You could even turn this around and you could do something like this. Chat. So go ahead and introduce your consonant digraphs in a way that you feel comfortable, but do introduce them before you get through all 7 of your syllables. So that's all I have for you today. And that was a pretty quick run through of how I introduce syllables. Now I have a lot more lessons and a lot more games that I play with all of these concepts. So this is really just dipping your toe in and understanding the fact that in Montessori, we need to do things just a little bit different with reading. In my opinion, we really need to organize those phonograms because the phonogram box, the green sandpaper letters, are not organized into a system. And there is a system. There is a reason why words do the things they do. And we can teach that through a sensorial impression. And in that sensorial impression, we're going to introduce all 7 of the syllables, and we're going to introduce the H brothers or the consonant digraphs. I'm making up my system based on my training, my experience in both Montessori and Orton-Gillingham. I'm developing something that works for me, that I feel is more concrete, is more visual, and it's an easier way, in my opinion, to introduce that concept of the syllables and also start introducing that idea of syllable division. We don't have to explain syllable division, but we do have to explain syllables, those chunks of sound. And when we hear those chunks of sound and we're writing those words, we might want to make that visual divider. And we really want to emphasize that. And that's why it's really important when those students come in at 2.5 to 3 years old into your primary group, that you really, really focus on sound games. I spy, syllables, rhyming, songs, poems, all that stuff is really important. And sometimes we forget about that in Montessori and we just do the sandpaper letters. We don't take a lot of time to think through all the different games that we need to do just by listening. If you have questions, leave them down below. I will make a follow-up video to any questions that you have. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope this makes sense. If you have any comments, leave them down below. If you have any questions, I'll get back to you. And hopefully I will see you in the next video.